Paul's letter to the Romans is one of the great pieces of literature in all of ancient literature. When you think of great works of ancient literature, you might think of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, or Homer's Odyssey, or the Iliad, or Virgil's Aeneid. But in fact, none of those documents have had anywhere near the influence or the impact as Paul's letter to the Romans. So it behooves us to study it closely, prayerfully, and carefully. The thing about Romans is it's different from Paul's other letters, with the possible exception of Ephesians. Romans is written to people that Paul did not convert. It's written to an audience he had never visited, and yet he desperately wanted to visit them. And you can see that from the very first chapter to the last. He's got travel plans. He's hoping to go to Rome. But in fact, something intervenes. When he takes the collection to Jerusalem in about 57 AD, he is detained in Jerusalem by the Roman authorities, spends 2 years under house arrest in Jerusalem until about 59, and is finally shipped to Rome by the authority of Roman justice so that his trial may be heard before Caesar Augustus himself. So Paul hopes to come quickly to the Romans after writing this letter. In fact, 3 years or maybe a little less intervened before he ever got there. So what kind of document is this? Well, it has an epistolary or letter opening. It has an epistolary closing with greetings at the end of it, but this hardly explains the vast majority of this document. In fact, what we have in Romans is, like all of Paul's other letters, an oral text, a text that's meant to be heard, and not just in any oral form, it's in a rhetorical form. So what we actually have in Romans is a carefully restructured rhetorical discourse. It's a deliberative discourse, that is, it's arguing for the audience to change their behavior and beliefs in the near future. And it includes a whole series of arguments, one after another, as Paul mounts his case to get the audience to change their worldview in various ways in regard to belief and behavior. So in fact, they will be well prepared to receive Paul and hear better his gospel when he finally arrives. So that's the first thing to be said about it. Scholars don't debate whether Paul wrote this, so thank goodness we don't have to talk about that, nor do they doubt that the audience is actually Christians in Rome, mainly Gentile Christians in Rome. The situation in Rome was delicate. Claudius had banned various Jewish Christians from Rome for a variety of squabbles with the synagogue, and they had only just returned in 55. So they were only in the process of reestablishing themselves with the Christian community in Rome by the time Paul wrote this in AD 57. And in fact, the dominant form of Christianity in Rome had become Gentile Christianity as a result. So part of the function of this document is to try to get Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians back together again, if you will, and in more of a unified force rather than meeting separately and not really knowing each other very well. You could really see this at the end of the document, where Paul tells the Gentile Christians to greet a whole list of Jewish Christians, Andronicus and Junia, Priscilla and Aquila, Phoebe, and so on, as he tries to reconcile the two factions, if you will, in the Roman Christian church before he even arrives, or at least begin the rapprochement. So the beginning of Paul's discourse in Romans 1, and from the start to the finish, he's going to emphasize the Jewishness of his gospel message. He's going to say that the good news of Jesus Christ is for the Jew first and also for the Gentile. Unlike many of his other letters, he's going to begin by talking about Jesus' Jewish heritage. He is a son of David, of the seed of Abraham, if you will. And he is in particular the Jewish Messiah. And he's going to argue further along that line throughout this document to make clear that God has not forsaken his first chosen people, Israel. Indeed, in Romans 9 through 11, he's going to make a strong case that God is still committed to saving his first chosen people, Israel, as well as Gentiles too. So this discourse is meant to make Gentile Christians in particular understand better their indebtedness to Israel and to the faith heritage of Abraham. And he is going to argue that case, one argument after another, in the book of Romans. So let's just take a couple of minutes here at the outset and notice what happens in the thesis statement, if you will, that is in Romans 1:16 through 18. Paul says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the good news of salvation for the Jew first, and also for the Gentile." And then he begins to talk about the righteousness of God. The theme of this whole document is the righteousness of God, which refers to not only the character of God, but to God setting right fallen human beings back into right relationship with him, what Wesley called justification. So he's going to ring the changes in all the Greek words that have to do with righteousness. Dikaiao, the verb, to be righteous. Dikaios, a righteous person. Dikaiosune, righteousness. This is the subject of this discourse, and I want to read for you now the way he puts it. Here's what he says in the thesis statement that sets up the arguments that follow. "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, but first to the Jew, then also to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is from the faithful one unto faith, just as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." And there at the end he's quoting Habakkuk. We've been used to studying this and thinking about Romans for a long time. And so some of coming at Romans freshly is actually unlearning some of the things we may have heard about Romans. You see, Romans is actually, of all the biblical books, the most commented on book in the whole Bible. And the most commented on passage in the whole Bible is not John 3:16, it's Romans 7 to 25. Yes, that is the most commented on passage in all of ancient literature, in fact. So in some ways, we have to, if you will, strip away the veneer of many things we've heard along the way about Romans and rehear it with fresh ears and look at it with fresh eyes. And I hope that's what will happen as you study Romans during this time together. But let me leave you with just this thought. Paul has got to demonstrate how God can be both just and the justifier of fallen human beings. How God can both be righteous and at the same time set right sinners. This is the great conundrum that Paul will address with his gospel throughout this document. And by addressing that central issue, he will seek to unite Jew and Gentile in Christ Jesus. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and therefore there is no place for boasting. For all of us have right standing with God by grace through faith in the faithful one, Jesus himself.